I'm going to go ahead and have Jenna just leave it on my sermon title the whole time. I'm going to jump around, and I don't want you trying to chase the sermon. She is so excited. She's like, thank you. Just leave it on here. So if you hear scriptures and you want to reference them, you are welcome to do so. The reason I said it's a challenge this morning is that we often, when we talk about topics in church, we only want the model, right? We want to talk about what is good, what is right, what is glorious. But when we miss the mark, by the way, does anybody do archery? So you fire. Do you know what they call it if you miss the mark on the target? You have the target out there and in the middle, and then you have an X that is off the mark. Do you know what they call that distance? In archery, they call it the sin distance. That's the sin. The sin is the distance from missing the mark. And so when we talk about sin, the challenge as a church is that we're not sure how to talk about it, because if we don't make the mark, we still struggle in our really, I'd say, a shallow faith, a superficial faith that says, we missed the mark, let's not talk about it because you can't do anything about it, and we're missing forgiveness that comes with it. Well, why is this important today? Because I talked about marriage, and last week we talked about marriage. It was really fun to celebrate with Carl and Lori, their 40th. I celebrated last weekend, Peyton and Kelsey got married. I always love the wedding day. But the wedding day is just the beginning, right? That's my favorite. You know, you can say to that young couple, this is the best you're ever going to look. This is the best you're ever going to feel. It's all down here. It's all downhill from here. You know, it just gets harder. It gets lighter on top, guys, right? It gets to be in sickness and in health, and you're like, in sickness is a lot. You know, we go through, if you really want to live life together. So to get married is great, but So then last week we said Carl and Lori, 40 wonderful years together. Did you know Roger and Janet Blankenship for the friendship class, they caught me after the first service. They've been going to the 8:30 service. I did their 60th renewal vow ceremony 6 years ago. They're celebrating 66 years together. It's amazing, isn't it? Roger was just glowing. Janet rolled her eyes. It's usually the thing, right? Oh, they're wonderful. It's beautiful. Well, that's the model. As we talk about marriage and life together, and behind the scenes, you're like, but our marriage isn't perfect, and we're not great. And some of you that aren't married, you're like, well, what does this have to do with me? Well, a reminder, the reason the model matters is that's the closest human relationships can come to God's own self, right? When we talk about marriage, Genesis 2:24, for this reason a man will leave his mother and father. It literally means to cut off, to leave the mother and father, be united, bonded to his wife, and they become one. Well, Paul says in Ephesians 5, that oneness, that is the image of Christ and his church. It's like Jesus knew from the beginning of time, if Adam and Eve, they can be bonded together, that's the close, if they can reproduce and be co-creators with me, the co-creators of human beings, imago Dei, image bearers, that's the closest we get. And so you want to see marriages that make it, and you want to learn from the marriages that don't make it, because we're all going to be impacted by divorce, by the divorce from God's plan. I shared with the first service some of the statistics. Divorce rate is down to 40%. It was at 55%. Now, we can celebrate divorce is going down, but the reason it's going down is, anybody got a guess? They're not getting married anymore. And I still have people who say to me, I don't need that piece of paper. I said, I'm going to get a little bit, I'm just going to be honest with you. This is a passion for me. I love those of you that are ordained. You drive me crazy. You're like, I got ordained. I'm like, I got 5 years in seminary. It tells me I'm ordained, right? You're like, I got a piece of paper. I'm like, well, you want, my journey as in ordination is to journey with people through their marriage, their life together. So when somebody on the other side says, well, it's just a piece of paper, my whole theological brain just sort of wants to explode. Like a piece of, you know what the wedding is? It's you standing up in front of everybody. Don't backdoor the relationship and be like, well, people see us together, but we share the same address and we're kind of together, but we have separate last names and separate checking accounts. And I'm like, stand on this stage and look to everybody else and say, I do this and no other. Why are we so afraid of saying? It's like what Rick Warren said about Christians who don't want to go to church. There are no orphans. And he said, nobody would say to God, God, I love you, I just can't stand your wife. God doesn't want that. God is proud and privileged of the church, the bride of Christ. We get to be a part of that. No husband, no man should be with a woman and say, well, I'm just not sure I want people to know about it. What? Own it. Own it. And so that is what I'm so passionate about, is that witness, that moment of saying, yes, in front of friends and family, we make this pronouncement. And I did have a lady say to me, I said, was it different from living together and getting married? And she sort of blew me off because the pastor, and she's like, I just don't think that's a big deal. It's just a piece of paper. And she found me after the fact and said, you know what? I need to tell you something. It is different. And I said, how's it different? She said, before, when we weren't married, I think I still had a little, travel luggage, emotionally, or just like like I could still go. And I said, what happened when you got married? She said, I unpacked it. Like that was something that mattered. Well, what are we really afraid of? What we're afraid of is when you get married, we see also that there's divorce. And I want to share with you this morning a little bit of space there. And so as difficult as it is, if you've been divorced, if you come from a relationship, a marriage, your family, your parents got divorced, we don't talk enough about it. And the reason we don't talk about it is in the church, we cherry pick scriptures, and then we shame people to say, if you've been divorced, you can never be the same, right? There's a little passage that everybody goes to. They always quote Jesus' passage in Matthew 19:8. Jesus said, Moses permitted you to divorce your wife because your hearts were hardened, but it was not that way from the beginning. Jesus is saying you're supposed to not get divorced. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, and you've all probably heard this, and some of you read this, you feel guilty. I'm going to give you a lot of grace this morning on this very poorly presented scripture. Except for sexual immorality, that's what the church always says. And then you shouldn't marry again, right? If you marry another woman, you commit adultery. So then some of you are like, oh boy, I got remarried. How does that work? I got news for you. God's model of the perfect marriage is really, really hard. I also know that people don't get it right the first time. It's a challenge we have to face. It's not that we condone it, right? We're not saying, and anybody who's been divorced, who's been a part of a family divorce, you look at it and go, no, it's not fun. It's the hardest thing to do. Let me give you an example of how difficult it is emotionally. The Holmes and Ray stress scale listed the things that are the most stressful for adults. Are you ready? At number 10 on the list, retirement. Believe it or not, some of you that retire, that's really hard. On a scale of 100, retirement, people said, was a 45. Marriage itself is a 50. Marriage is really hard. Do you want to know what the number one thing is, the most stress people have? Death of a spouse. The greatest stress put on a person's life is when their spouse dies. Do you want to know what is right beneath that? Divorce. Do you know what's right beneath divorce? The most stressful thing on a person is marital separation. Underneath that is imprisonment. We're less stressed about getting arrested and going to jail than we are about marital separation or divorce. So what are the sociologists, what are the psychologists talking about? What are they pointing out? Well, they're emphasizing this very relationship that we want is also really, really hard, and it takes a toll on us when it doesn't work out. I shared a couple weeks ago about a cracking foundation that we sort of see the model. We say it's so hard, let's just not do it. Let's not have that anymore. And yet we know we're longing for that intimacy, that stability. By the way, that's what we're going to talk about in the next few weeks about parents. It matters for your kids that they have those role models in their lives. And again, even if you make the mistake that is a challenge you had of the past, you're like, okay, but how do I keep making it and moving it forward with God's grace? Where is the redemption? And how do I show my kids that redemptive spirit as well? All right, let me go through. My daughter was home this weekend. We've been talking, and I laughed. I go, I'm really struggling with this sermon. And we talked about a study. The Gottmans, the husband and wife, did studies back in the 80s. I go, oh my gosh, totally forgot about this study that I studied in college in the 90s, right? They took couples, they put them in an apartment, and they watched them, observed them for 24 hours. And then what they were trying to do is they're trying to determine what were the emotional bonding, what was the connecting of the couples. And then they followed them for about 15, 20 years to see how their marriages ended up. Okay. Another one of the studies, they followed that in 24 hours. They also had them in a room and they said, tell us something you disagree about. And then they observed them arguing about those disagreements. They measured all these different cues, microaggressions, the smiles, the smirks, the sarcasm. And they determined that with 90% accuracy, how many of those couples would get divorced over that span. Now, they're 90%. So they call it the 4 horsemen of divorce. And this is what is problematic in relationships. The first one was criticism, just attacking your partner's character. Now, how many of you, not even in a marriage, know somebody who, when you have a disagreement, they make it personal? They get personal real fast. That's an insecurity that is a death nail for relationships. Instead of talking about the behavior, I often counsel couples, and they'll say things like, you always, you never. You go, that's pretty strong verbiage, isn't it? Why? Because you're wanting to attack them as a person. The second one is contempt. This is probably the most dangerous one. Eye-rolling, sarcasm, mockery. This is in contempt. It is a signal of superiority. I just resent you. You're beneath me. Any relationship that shows contempt is truly doomed. You want to look past these. Defensiveness. This is usually the other person in the relationship. One person is asserting their superiority. They just look to you in contempt. And the other person tends to be very defensive, falls into victimhood, feeling always attacked, those personal attacks. But as a result, they share in the problems because they never take responsibility. And then the last one they mentioned is stonewalling. Emotional withdrawal, shutting down, not communicating. My wife's not here, so I can talk about her. That's great. She's in Children's Church. We had that early in our marriage. We will not let the sun go down. Folks, it was 2 or 3 in the morning some nights. And I have to admit, I'm terrible. I'm the one that says, it's resolved, it's resolved. And then as we lay in the bed, and I say something like, I was right. Whoop! Standing back, staring at each other across the bed, and you're like, you, and I don't believe it. And I'm like, and the worst part for me is I'm like, you're so cute when you're angry. That does not go over very well. I got into bigger fights. The point is that stonewalling, when you have that distance, the separation, these are things. So what can we say? And you say, okay, but then do I want a loveless marriage? No, I will say God allows divorce to be rare and grieved. Let me say that again. When you look at it and go, is it the unredeemable? Now, this is where as a church we've done a terrible job. We've just sort of shamed this conversation to say we shouldn't be proud of it. That's true. And I also shared with my daughter that I had a youth ministry leader who wanted to be proud of getting divorced with the youth. Just brought it up constantly. I had to pull her aside. I said, Becky, I can't have you always telling them about how much you don't like your ex-husband and how glad you are to be free. Let's talk about other things, but that can't be front and center every time. And I think part of it was her trying to process getting out of a bad marriage. But then as a result, we don't talk about it at all. And so then we go into the scripture and we're like, oh, well then if you get divorced, it should be only for infidelity. And if you get divorced and then you can't get remarried, we've missed it. And I'm going to give you context for how bad that is because it's not the irredeemable sin, okay? Let me give you, for example, when Jesus said, except for sexual immorality and marries another woman, he commits adultery, he is speaking in context to 2 schools of thought. There were Pharisees. You know how Democrats have different groups within their party? Republicans have different. You should argue within your groups, right? Well, that's sort of iron sharpens iron. Well, the Pharisees argued within themselves. And one of the groups, the Shammai, the Pharisees who had that school of discipline, they were very strict about divorce. It was only for infidelity, and you shouldn't get remarried. But then you had the Hillels. And the Hillels was a training of thought that was more forgiving. It was loose interpretation of the Old Testament and about divorce. And what Jesus was confronting is the Pharisees, and that was becoming more prominent. They were dismissing their wives at every turn. They're like, I can find a reason to divorce you in this loophole. And Jesus didn't like that these women, these wives, were vulnerable to that practice. So he is countering it. Well, what's he countering it? Well, the most important things he says, your hearts were hardened. And that's probably the worst place for a relationship to be. And what is he also highlighting? Read Hosea, by the way. Hosea married Gomer, who was going to be unfaithful to him. God told him that. He said, you're going to do it anyway. You're going to have kids with her, because that is how Hosea's life was the embodiment of how God felt about his people who continued to be promiscuous with other gods, even though they were to be bonded, united with God alone. So Jesus is having this echo of the relationship you're supposed to have with God is what you're supposed to have with the marriage, but when you fail, what do you do? What's really, in that verse as well is that there's going to be some exceptions. I've never counseled an abusive couple and said, yep, go back to that house. I also appreciate on some level, I think it's a bit legalistic, but how many of you know what it's called in Catholicism, that if it's the first marriage and it wasn't blessed by God, they do what's called an annulment, right? There's a little bit of truth to that. Like, let's be honest, how many of you, when your kid turns 16, you have confidence they'll make the best decisions driving? I mean, God love him. I'm sorry, I love this illustration. Dylan wrecked both his parents' car the day he got his license, right out here. He pulled one into the other and had to come inside to go, I wrecked the car. Well, I mean, cars. Like, that's like, how do you trust a 16-year-old with a driver? Like, a kid goes to college. When you're 22, 18, 19, 20, and you go to college and you leave college and you throw your college away and you got tons of debt and you didn't graduate. Like, it's a lot to ask young people to make these big decisions. Now, we should. So let me say this to the young people out there. This is going to be a lesson on Youth Sunday. You guys ready? Date a lot. Date often. And keep it platonic. Leave room for Jesus. Does that make sense? Young people, leave room for Jesus. What am I really saying? I'm saying you should date, because what does dating do? It teaches you about a relationship you want to eventually have. You're testing the waters. You're like, oh, you're learning about yourself, right? When I dated girls, they were like, I don't think I want to go out again. I'm like, I wonder what I said. What did I do? Oh, I was really loud, right? I had those moments. I dated a girl who was vegan. I realized that I ordered a 16-pound steak and just ate it like I was a caveman, and we didn't go out again. I wonder why. Like, those are things you should go out and date platonic, right? Have fun. They used to call them like social circles, like group dating, where you just sort of sit next to somebody and you have conversations. You ease into it. But if you don't have those lessons, if you don't have your heart broken when you're young, you're not learning what it really means to get into this bonded future relationship, right? And it's really hard to ask young people, so we make those mistakes. Again, there's plenty of scriptures that address this challenge. It is rare and it grieves God when it happens, but it might be the sin of bad choosing to begin with, and it also might be the sin of a person's heart hardened in the relationship. Most people will read 1 Corinthians 7, and they'll read 1 Corinthians 7 and say, well, Paul says that you shouldn't get married or remarried. You guys understand 1 Corinthians 7, Paul is writing, ready? I'm going to give you the verse. Verse 7:26, because of the present crisis. Paul actually says throughout 1 Corinthians 7, don't get married. Why? My mom, when 20 years ago, so our kids were little, she's like, I just can't wait for Jesus to come again. And I'm like, I can. She goes, you don't want Jesus to come again? I got little kids. Tribulation, the wrath of God. No, you're 60. You've raised your kids. Of course you're like, I don't want to go through getting old. Take me now, Jesus. I'm like, what about me? She actually, she goes, I get that. Did you know that the World War II, marriage spiked the first year the war started? Everybody's like, get married before they get sent away. Marriage crashed. Nobody was getting married during the war. And then marriage spiked again right after the war. Like we were relieved, we were hopeful. You baby boomers are the product of that, right? They all came home, we're like, we won the greatest, most difficult war in the history of the world. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 is really afraid at the persecution of Christians what it would be like to get married. So he says, if you're getting married, stay married, don't have kids. It's like, it's not a good idea to raise kids in this troubled time. If you're not married, don't get married. Like, hey, it's a context in which Paul is speaking to the church. So here's the larger scope of the Bible. Ready? If it was irredeemable, Abraham would not have then had Sarah, but he had Hagar. What do you do with that story? God blessed the second-born, Isaac. In fact, he blessed them both. Polygamy, by the way, was familiar in the Old Testament. It was not condoned by God, but it certainly wasn't irredeemable by God. What do you do with the woman who was caught in adultery? Jesus says, you've been married 5 times, and the man that you're with, you're not married with now. But what does he say to her? If you would ask me, I would give you living water. You see that? It's redeemable. The woman caught in adultery, who is breaking all of the covenant, all of them. And what does he do? He says to the people who picked up the stones, you who's without sin, cast the first stone. He turns it on them. Of course, he looks to her. He doesn't ignore it. He doesn't condone it. What does he say? Redeemable. Go and sin no more. What I often ask a couple who has gone through divorce, it's been a part of my ministry here the last 20-some years. How will you heal from this? How will you get better from this? How will you help your loved ones heal who went through it? And ultimately, how do you become more holy? What did you learn? What was wrong about this relationship that you will not repeat in the next relationship? How will you then turn this chapter into a forward chapter? I give you a real easy illustration with this. This is often what we struggle with. You may not even know, but everybody, look behind you. Who is behind you? Go ahead, just look behind you. Like, oh, I didn't know you guys sat there. That's amazing. Some of you pointed some people out, and you're like, you guys sit way back there? You should come to the front row. It's so fun. All right, now, what you just did is what you do in life all the time. You constantly refer to your past. Learn from it. Your past is like rearview mirrors. You should learn from it. You shouldn't be blindsided by it, but you have to decide to move forward. And the redemption is in what that looks like. If you didn't get it, you're part of that second marriage group that gets divorced 85% of the time. It gets worse. It gets harder. But you might be redeemable in the space of loving another. And do you know how important it is for God to want you in that relationship? I'm sorry, I got to show it, Jenna. Go to the picture with the bowl. This is kintsugi. This is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery, and I absolutely love this. I would love to get into it, but I can't afford it because they fill so when a pottery is broken, and they don't intentionally break it. They love to find pottery that was accidentally broken. And then they receive that pottery, and then they take gold flakes, actual gold, and they repair the pottery with those gold flakes. They glue it and infuse it in. And the bowl, for example, this one, is far more expensive and precious in value than it was as an ordinary bowl. Now, if you're here this morning, you've been divorced, you're part of a divorced family, you've had a relationship that you were bonded to. It doesn't even have to just be marriage. We know our older adult children and estranged relationships, and you feel like it has been. I want you to appreciate God's redemptive story, a future chapter, a present chapter in your life. Let his redemptive work take hold. Don't make excuses for it. Don't fall into bad behavior, bad habits. Confess. Be free. Lay it at the cross. But let's move forward and know that in doing so, your story in its redemption is gold to other people around you. It is amazing how people will look to you and go, I love how you guys made this work. I love how you're honest about your mistakes in your past, but you're making it right in this and moving forward. For some of you parents, be open with your kids. Tell them, don't pretend it didn't happen. Don't ignore it. If they hear you being transparent and honest and true, it's amazing how they will appreciate it even more, because it's you allowing the grace of God to fuse those pieces back together in your life. Let me give you that last verse. Jenna, give me that next picture. This is what we go back to. In the Bible it says the only thing that is unforgivable is the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. So even where it is very broken parts of our lives, go back to this verse over and over again. There is now no condemnation. Grieve it, suffer through it, hardships within the family. But for those who are in Christ Jesus, you catch that? Make your relationship right with Jesus. Get right with Jesus. The more you're right with Jesus, then he is the one through the Spirit who gives life and has what? Set you free.